Hello again, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me this evening as we look at Japanese prints. This is going to be just a very broad overview of what is a very long history of Japanese prints. And previously, I talked about the relationship between Japanese prints and the French Impressionists, focusing on how these prints were received by French artists and audiences and how that impacted their art that was produced. So it was very focused on reception and on the Western reception of these works. By contrast, this talk will situate these prints within their original context of Japanese art. And we'll start out by talking about the context in which prints developed and flourished, looking at the printing process before moving on to talk about early prints in Japan, and then focusing on the genre of Uki Away, looking at the different genres and masters of printmaking, and then how that tradition fed into the manga tradition that we know of today. Now, ukiyo-e flourished at a time in Japanese history called the Tokugawa Shogunate, and it was a time of unprecedented peace, sustained peace and stability, but it had been preceded by a period of almost constant war and instability. In fact, this period is called the Warring States period, the Sengoku. And during the Sengoku, Japan was splintered into many different territories that were ruled by warlords, essentially, who fought each other for territory with shifting alliances. And with the establishment of the shogunate, this instability was finally put to rest. But this unity, this stability, was only achieved through the efforts of the so-called three great unifiers of Japan. The unification of Japan was begun by Oda Nobunaga, who was assassinated by one of his followers, and then the project was picked up by his vassal Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who was in turn succeeded by Tokugawa Ieyasu, who finally finished the unification of Japan under a single ruler. And so this period is named after him, after his family name of Tokugawa, and referred to as the Tokugawa Shogunate. Ieyasu took on the title of shogun, which is an abbreviation of Sei Taishogun, which means commander-in-chief of the expeditionary forces against the barbarians. Now, the barbarians refers to anyone who is not Japanese, so basically everybody. And the system established during the shogunate was extremely strict. It was a caste system with essentially three different levels. At the very top was the emperor and the shogun. Now, the emperor was the titular head of Japan. However, in practice, it was really the shogun who had all of the authority. And then the shogun was the head of the samurai class, the top caste in this moment in Japanese history. Next are farmers, peasants, fishermen. And then in the bottom tier, we have artisans and craftsmen and merchants who occupy the same level. Now, outside of this system, we have a group called outcasts or eta, people who were associated with death, butchers, hide tanners, grave diggers, executioners. And this was due to this Neo-Confucian philosophy that was adopted by the samurai and the abhorrence of anything that had to do with death. So the Eta had no rights, and even to this day, there is discrimination against people whose ancestors came from this outcast group. Now, also outside of this system are actors, musicians, courtesans, and then monks, priests, and nuns, or the religious class. And then finally, we have criminals who were actually so far excluded from mainstream society that they were called non-humans. Now, the reason I'm referring to these different levels as castes rather than classes is because you were locked into your position. If your father was a farmer, then you were a farmer, and your children will be farmers, and so on and so on. You could not marry outside of your caste. You could not change castes. An artisan could become a merchant because they're still within the same caste, and a samurai could retire and farm on an estate. So he could be, in practice, a farmer because of his activity. However, he would remain a samurai. So it was a very rigid system. And it, again, was not a reflection of economic prosperity, but of social status. And within each of these little units, of course, there were also little hierarchies. So there were some courtesans who were ranked higher than others, and so forth. So within this social system, it was so rigid and there was no shifting between castes that there's this development of microcultures within each caste level. The imperial court was located in the city of Kyoto, and over time had developed a particular courtly culture. It sponsored a type of art called Yamato. And Yamato is a very elegant, beautiful style that started out as being an extension of the Tang Dynasty Chinese style, but went on to develop in its own direction. And it's characterized by blank areas of golden clouds or mist, like you see here, small, even delicate figures, and this cutaway view into buildings from an oblique bird's eye perspective. The subject were often drawn from literature, poetry, history, and so on, as you see in this example here. Now, in the 16th century, Yamato begins to depict common folk, sort of pastoral scenes with peasants. And while these people were depicted, this art was definitely not for common people. It was very much restricted to the court, to the aristocracy. Now, the samurai class, by contrast, and the shogunate had its center in Edo, which is modern-day Tokyo. And they sponsored a school of painting that was founded by the Kano family, and thus called the Kano School of Painting. And the Kano school was heavily influenced by Chinese literati painting. So this folding screen is quite large. It was meant to be a divider in rooms. And it's a direct imitation of a very famous Chinese painter. The subject is also very Chinese in its depiction of the Neo-Confucian four accomplishments. So the four accomplishments were abilities that a respectable scholar should master. On the left, we see a few groups of people, some men playing the game Go. Zoom in here. Yeah. On the left, you can see them grouped around the board. To the right, behind the tree, there's a table set up for calligraphy. And then on the far right is a scholar crossing a bridge with a servant who carries some kind of musical instrument with him. And then on the other side of the panel is the fourth accomplishment, which is painting. So painting, music, calligraphy, and Go. And the samurai really adopted this Neo-Confucian outlook. The Kano school was the dominant school of art in Japan for a very long time, and it varied somewhat, but it always had this Chinese influence. Here's another example, a much more elaborate screen painting depicting the four seasons with heavy use of gold leaf. And again, another characteristic of the Kano school. And if you think about how this screen would appear in use in a room where candlelight and lanterns were used with the light reflecting off of the gold leaf background, it must have been really spectacular, very beautiful and glamorous. And that was part of the point. It was a display of power and opulence. Now, art was really restricted at this time to the uppermost castes, to the court, to the shogunate, to wealthy samurai families, and perhaps wealthy temples would have had art in them, wealthy temples, and then highest ranking courtesans may have had art. But for the vast majority of people, art was something that they had no access to. It was completely something that they may not have even seen, except perhaps when they went to temples. But what happens during the Tokugawa shogunate is that this new peace, this new stability, and granted it was a very rigid peace, that was established only through very strict rules. But this stability enabled people to now devote time, energy, resources, capital to the production of goods that were not devoted to war. So to growing and developing an economy. Trade was able to happen now that people could travel safely. So the economy really flourished. And so what begins to happen is that the merchants, while on the bottom of the caste system socially, end up being at the top of the economic period, having substantial financial resources. Now, you may be surprised to see artisans and merchants on the bottom of the caste system, as in the West, we are used to thinking of them as composing the so-called middle class. And this is, again, due to the Neo-Confucian belief system. Peasants, farmers, and fishermen are engaged in honest, productive labor. They're, working the land and, producing food that support the population. As an aside, farmers actually had to pay a tax of approximately 40% of their rice to the government, to the shogunate. By contrast, merchants were seen as simply benefiting off of the labor of others, as parasites, essentially. They were also the money lenders because the samurai considered money to be dirty. It was too worldly and not intellectual enough. But of course, they still depended upon the merchants to lend them money. So the samurai essentially just exported this unwanted practice to the lowest class and then made use of them. So what happens is that we have the rise of a stable economy. We have the flourishing of an artisanal and craftsman class. And now that we have the establishment of trade and merchants, we see the development of an urban culture that is distinct from the courtly or samurai cultures. One of these innovations that is unique to the urban artisan merchant class is kabuki theater. Fast food develops at this time, and food delivery. People start eating soba noodles for the first time. So this culture is really distinct from the culture of the court or the culture of the samurai class. The samurai patronized the Kano school, as I mentioned, and the performing art that they sponsored was no theater. The imperial court supported the Yamato style and bugaku theater, and then the merchants of Edo society favored kabuki theater and, in the visual arts, Uki Away. Now, Uki Away is a term that is often applied to refer to prints in general. However, it's technically just identifies a genre. It literally means pictures of the floating world. That is, the floating world in the sort of Buddhist sense of the everyday world being simply a fleeting world. It's ephemeral, it's floating, and will just pass away like the mist. So ukiyo-e means pictures of everyday subject matter, of things that don't have necessarily moral content or religious or historical or noble purposes. Ukiyo-e can describe paintings as well as prints. Again, it's a genre term. And so here we have a painting example of ukiyo-e by Chobunsai Aishi, who also designed prints. Now, printing had existed in Japan for quite a while before this. It first appears in the 8th century AD. So before this, there were imported prints from China and from Korea, but this is the first time that we see printing actually being done in Japan. And these were woodblock prints of different prayers. Then in the 11th and 16th centuries, or through 16th centuries, that is, printing was primarily used for books and for Buddhist texts. So like this sutra that we see here with the text on the left, and then this very complex illustration on the right. And shortly after that, in the early 17th century, we see illustrated books appearing. So here we have an example of a page from this edition of the Issei Monogatari with writing on the right and then on the facing page, an illustration of the scene being described. And it wasn't long before the publishers identified a market for the illustrations themselves, independent of the text. And so we first see just images without text, without being part of a story, in the 1658. The pioneer of these single illustrations, you might say, was Hishikawa Harunobu, and you see a very typical example of his work here. This is a type of print called sumizuri-e, which means a black ink print. So it's just produced using black ink on paper that has not been colored at all. Now, the printing process was done basically by carving a block of wood, and you see that block, an example of one of these blocks here on the left. The negative space, so the space that you don't want to be black, is carved away, and you produce a stamp. And we can see this representation of the printing process in a wood block from the first half of the 19th century, so later, by Utagawa Kunisada, representing the printing process, but instead of having men, as would usually be the case, the men are replaced by women because they're more interesting and sell better. And so you have the different stages of the process. On the right is an artist drawing out the draft, what is called the underpainting for the print. And then that painting is passed on to the carver, who pastes it to a block of wood, and then is chipping away the negative space using different chisels and hammers. Now, what's interesting is that although these sumizuri-e prints were done simply in black and white, they could be hand colored. And so on the left, we have a really fantastic example of a hand-colored print using vegetable dyes. And there were even cases when the publishers would give instructions or include instructions on the image in case the consumer, the purchaser, wanted to paint it themselves. So the color could be added either by a professional under the direction of the publisher, or by the purchaser, kind of almost a paint by numbers sort of thing. This is an example of one type of Uki Away called shunga, which is euphemistically called spring pictures, but they are erotic pictures. These two are quite tame. And I will not be showing you any more explicit ones, although they do get extremely explicit. And as is usually the case for any new medium that humans come up with, pornography and erotic images were one of the first uses applied to printmaking. After sumizuri-e, the just plain black prints, the next development in the printmaking evolution was the introduction of tane, which are prints that included red pigment made from lead, as you see here on the right. So they're just touches of this pigment that have been added by hand. This is an example of another genre called yakushe, which are portraits of kabuki actors. So specifically kabuki, not other theater. Because again, these are images that are made by and for the merchant and artisan classes. And so they want to see their own theater, the kabuki theater that they patronized and developed and enjoyed. One of the interesting things, sorry to return to the yakushe, one of the interesting things about the kabuki actor prints is that they would often be used, even commissioned by the actors from the artists, and then passed out by the actor as a kind of advertisement to promote them. And some of these actors became extremely popular. And so there was a kind of symbiotic relationship between the printmakers and artists and the actors, as each benefited the other in the promotion of their work. Here's the next sort of introduction or advancement in printing technology is benizurier, which are red dye prints that are using safflower color. Now, this is an incredibly ornately colored print. It uses not just the safflower dye, but also brass, other plant dyes, and then a glaze. It's a type of glue that is painted over the top called nikala, and it gives this kind of shiny lacquered finish to the image. And this is an example of a perspective picture. And it is something that developed after the introduction of Western prints, specifically Dutch etchings, to Japan. The importation of foreign texts, European texts, was lifted for a time. And so Japanese artists were exposed to the printmaking of other cultures, of Western cultures. And so here we see what's really cool, and a Japanese print using Western linear perspective techniques. And so this central room, you can see, is constructed through this very rigid system of linear diagonal lines going to a center vanishing point, framed by this series of rectangles. But what's really interesting is that if you look out off to the side, to the right of this room, this linear perspective goes completely out the window, and all of a sudden the floorboards are flipped up. Like, there's a screen, and I don't know how where that screen is supposed to be. It seems kind of like it's floating. There are people peeking out around it who seem much too small. And so we have this odd conglomeration of bird's eye views, straight views, right next to this very precise linear perspective. So this combination of two different perspectival representations in the same image. Now, I mentioned that this is an extremely nice print, but needless to say, even the nicest woodblock print is infinitely less expensive than even the cheapest painting on silk or screen from the Kano school or in the Yamato style. So the really cool thing about woodblock printing is that it was something that was developed by the lower class, by the merchant class, for the merchant class, and it was affordable enough that people could actually buy them and enjoy them, and had access to art in their homes for pretty much the first time. With the introduction of more colors, excuse me, we have the introduction of the nishiki-e, or brocade picture, so-called because all of the colors in the print look like a textile, like a brocade fabric. The real pioneer of the nishiki-e is this artist Suzuki Harunobu. You can see there are many different colors in this image, and with so many colors, they had to find a faster system for printing color. You could no longer keep up with the demand by doing hand painting, by adding the color touches by hand. A black and white print you could produce 200 a day easily, but there's no way that the painters could keep up with that kind of rate. So the new techniques in color printing developed where they had a different block for each color. Now, sometimes you could combine more than one color on a block, but they could not be colors that were touching in the same composition. So what that means is that you could not have this red color and this blue-gray on the same block, because otherwise the colors would bleed. So they would have to be on separate blocks. You could also not have the red and the green because they are adjacent. And so this became an extremely complicated process of, 6, 8, even 10 different blocks. You can see that the robe that the woman wears is very elaborate, very detailed, and in some ways, these Uki Away prints became fashion plates, became demonstrations of fashionable styles and designs and ways for women to wear their hair. Now, Harunobu really specialized in presentations of beautiful women called bijinga. And here we have one of his images that's very beautiful in its simplicity. Rather than a complete riot of different colors, we have a really rather restrained palette that adds to the grace and simplicity of the image, as we have this woman with her parasol in the snow. So far we've only just gotten started with the early years of Uki Away and already seen most of the genres that would be popular in printmaking. So we have bijinga, or images of beautiful women, perspective pictures, shunga, yashuke, and then we'll look at pictures of heroes and legends, daily life, and then landscapes. So one of the great master of the actor print is this artist Toshusai Shiraku, who took the genre in a really unique direction. He specialized in bust portraits of the different actors, in which he would really exaggerate their characteristic features. So these became actual portraits of the different actors. You can see that this particular actor, his eyes are crossed, and his cheeks are kind of puffed up, and he has his fist in this kind of angry posture. And you'll notice that it's not just a portrait of the actor, Tanemura Tarazzo, but rather a portrait of the actor in this role, in one of his most popular roles. And so Shiraku is creating fan images, essentially, images of everybody's favorite actor in their most famous role, performing their sort of iconic gestures, their trademark gestures. And they're really exaggerated. Interestingly, these images were not very popular with the actors themselves because they found them unflattering. However, they were very popular with consumers and fans. Shiraku came along with these prints at a time when the luxury laws were really relaxed, and so he was able to use mica as a background pigment. So you can see on the left, this is the same print taken at a slightly different angle. So you can see the light reflecting off of this background. And it really adds a lot of dynamism and a lot of engagement and intensity to the image to have this radically different texture in the background, rather than simply plain paper as we would have with most prints. However, this was a very short-lived trend, and no one after Shiraku really did anything like this. He is considered, however, really the master of actor prints. Now, if Shiraku is a master of the actor print, Kitagawa Utamaro is considered a master of the beautiful women genre. Here is one of his portraits of Oseyo of the Hironoya Tea House. This would have been part of a series of images of beautiful women, and they were actual women who worked in Tokyo, or Edo, rather, at the time. So this was an actual waitress at a tea house who was known for being beautiful, and here she is celebrated in this print. Now, the great thing about having a series of prints is that you then encourage the consumer to collect them all, as it were. So this was just one of a series of many images of these local beauties. Here is another one of Utamaro's images, and he, like Shiraku, tended to favor these sort of waist up pictures. In this case, we don't have a real person being shown here, but rather a type. So one of the things that happened is that the shogunate really, really looked down on ukiyo-e, on print culture, and on kabuki theater. They saw it as having a deleterious effect on society, as corrupting the public morals, essentially, and saw this, this lower class as actually infecting the samurai class with its own loose morals. So the depiction of many things in print became illegal. There was a very rigorous censor process in which the final image of a print had to be approved by the censor before it could be published. And so in a way to get around this strict censorship was to cast a moralizing tone on the images. So here we have an image of a woman. Sometimes this is referred to as pipe because she's smoking, but it's also referred to as things like lazy one or something like that, where they're labeling this type of woman as someone who you want to stay away from. And in fact, this is a series of 10 types in the physiognomic study of women. So the idea, supposedly, is here are some images so you can identify these dangerous women. But of course, the subtext is, look at these really sexy women, loose women, and they'll often have these little texts that say something like, stay away from women who can't hold their liquor because they're very loose. And so it has a moralizing tone, but it really is anything but moral in intent. Now, one of the things that happened in reaction to this a heightened restriction in what could and could not be shown is the increased interest in landscape prints. Now, although people could travel during the shogunate because of the increased safety and security, like it was now safe to travel, travel was highly restricted. You could not simply decide you were going to go see someplace. So you could travel if you were a merchant with a permit, or you were a government official, or you were samurai class, but travel was not possible for most people. And so there was a general curiosity, however, about all of these different famous sites in Japan. And this interest was met with the production of landscape prints. And Katsushika Hokusai is, of course, very famous in the West, in the United States, and in Europe, and rightly so, for his incredible series of prints, off many of them depicting Mount Fuji from different perspectives. Now, just because we have limited time and space into today's talk, I'm just going to show you this one print by Hokusai, which is really gorgeous in its simplicity, in the very reduced colors, the minimal lines and shapes, in which this mountain is almost reduced to an abstract form. But what I really, really love about this particular print is the fact that you can see the grain of the wood from the block on the mountain, and it runs laterally, so horizontally, and almost contours the mountain and gives it a three-dimensional form by wrapping around this conical peak. And so the texture here is just exquisite. And what's interesting is because each of these prints were made by hand, I mean, they were mass produced, which enabled them to be cheap, but they were using blocks that wear down over time. and the ink might be applied slightly differently with each block, or the pressure might be applied differently. And so each individual printing is unique. So you will see other images of this print, or other prints with this motif that do not have this really nice, beautiful impression of the wood grain. Now here we have a work by one of my favorite, probably my favorite Uki Away artist, Tsukioka Yoshitoshi. This is an example of a legends, heroes and legends sort of painting. Sorry, not painting, print. And Yoshitoshi was really, really good at using perspective and the composition to add intensity and interest to the image. Now you'll notice this is much later. This is 1886. And so by this point, a lot of things have happened in Japanese history, but one of them is that now artists have been able to have access to Western art for the first time in a couple hundred years. And so Yoshitoshi is influenced by some of this new art in the creation of his compositions. But notice how we have this great sweeping wave that comes from the bottom right up into the left and echoes the curve of the moon and the prow of the ship and the curling waves, and it has this just exquisite motion to it. Now this is called or a print from the series 100 Aspects of the Moon. So the story, which would have been familiar to Japanese viewers at the time, is sort of secondary to the image of the moon in the terms of the title. From that same series, we have this image, again, an image of the hero who would have been known to viewers. And so the moon here becomes the consistent motif through this series. It becomes a kind of a witness to these different events in Japanese legend and history. This is a very different image compositionally. It's very quiet. It's much more still. But look at how we have so many different colors here. So many different shades of blue, some really intense colors, very saturated. This is my favorite of not just of Yoshitoshi's prints, but probably my favorite print ever. And so I have to show it to you because I think it's incredible. So here again, we have the moon in the sort of top just left of center, shrouded by these clouds of smoke that are lit up by this fire that is just raging. And the motion in this image is incredible. We have the flames sweeping diagonally across the image. You can notice the streamers on the firefighter's signal blowing in this heat, the wind caused by all the heat. The round top of his signal is echoed in the roundness of the moon. And the way that this firefighter in the foreground is, is kind of pressed over to the side, it adds this sense that we're just passing, that this is a fleeting view. And I have this strong impression that it's almost like a movie still, like the camera is going to either pan to the left or to the right in just the next moment. But it's a very engaging image, just absolutely stunning, and so I just had to share it with you. All right, so right before we looked at, right before Yoshitoshi was making those prints, rather, we have the very, very major event in Japanese history of its opening, so-called, to the West. So for hundreds of years, Japan only traded with the Qing Empire and with Korea and with the Netherlands on a very limited basis. The Netherlands had a small trading post on an island off of Japan, and no Netherlanders were allowed to go on to, main Japan. So those were the only countries that Japan traded with for hundreds of years under this isolation policy, until the United States uh, basically forced Japan to open in 1854. The US Navy sailed into the bay and said, trade with us or else. And other nations, Russia, Great Britain, France, and the Netherlands and France, there you go, were very quick to follow. Everyone demanded their own treaty with great trading rights. So this worked out great for those Western nations. For Japan, it set off this period of real instability, and the Tokugawa shogunate, with its caste system, was replaced by the Meiji Restoration, or the Meiji Empire. It's referred to as a restoration because it restored the emperor to the rule of the country, rather than the shogun being at the head. The caste system was at least officially removed, and Japan was forcibly put through this process of modernization and westernization by the emperor, who saw that really if Japan was ever going to have a chance of surviving in the world, they had to catch up to speed with these other nations. So here we have a print depicting the royal family, or imperial family rather, the empress on the left, the emperor on the right, and the Prince Haru in the middle. This is a work that it's really incredibly elaborate print. You'll notice the dyes, the colors are quite intense, and this is because they're no longer using vegetable dyes. They're using chemical dyes that were derived from coal tar that had been developed by the Germans, and were now available in Japan for the first time. So we have these very intense colors. This is the type of print that would be extremely expensive as prints went, and you would it might be sold as a set. So there are 3 different images, 3 different actual pieces of paper here, each with a different figure on it, and it could have been sold as a set or as single papers that you then collected. Now, of course, this opening and this restoration and this forced modernization did not have a completely smooth installation. And so this was a period of war, of civil war. And many of the prints at this time depicted that the fights, the battles, the crushing of resistance against the imperial authority. As you see here, here's again a 3-panel image, and these 3-panel images became more common as time went on. Again, using these very intense colors and showing the imperial authority being established against those who dissented. This is what is usually considered the end of Uki Away, as the prints that were available for a reasonable price, mass-produced and accessible to anyone, came to be replaced by other forms like photography, or more effective and faster forms of printing like lithography. And so printmaking is generally seen to kind of die out at this time. It survived in 3 different ways. One is in the genre of Shinhanga, which were prints that were made in the traditional manner, but aimed at Western audiences and collectors. So they were made as a group effort with a publisher, someone who designed the image, someone who carved it, someone who printed it. So these different division of labor was used to make these things, but they were aimed at the foreign audiences. Japanese audiences did not consider prints to be art. And these artists, these printmakers, had not had the kind of recognition that other artists did until Westerners began discovering these prints. The Impressionists, as I've talked about in another talk, were huge fans of Japanese woodblock prints. They sold extremely well overseas. And so the Japanese printmakers were like, well, hey, these guys, this foreign market really appreciates our work. So we're going to start marketing to them and producing works for them. The other way in which printmaking survived was through fukusei hanga, which are facsimiles and reproductions of older prints. So these could either be reprints, so reproductions, or they could be using the original block. This is a recarved painting after the Utamaro print that we saw earlier. And you'll notice that the colors here are very intense, again, using those modern dyes, so it looks very different than the original did. And then we have the third sort of branch, which is Sosaku Hanga, which means a creative print. And so these were prints that were made by artists who were usually trained in Western painting, Western painting styles, excuse me, but who used woodblock printing as another form of artistic expression. So where Hanga was commercial in purpose and kept the old structure of having multiple people working on the print, that workshop structure almost, the Sosaku Hanga were purely artistic. One person would conceive and create and print them in a very limited run. They were not for sale, they were art objects. Now, I would submit that Uki Away actually survived by sort of evolving into a different form, and that is through illustrations in magazines. So these are called kuchie, which could be either magazine images, or else they would be frontispieces for novels. And here we have an example of kuchie that is the frontispiece for a story in a magazine. And what's really interesting here is that we have on the right, in the inset, what would be really a fairly traditional ukiyo-e print of a beautiful woman. She's wearing her kimono. She has fairly standard features and style, but then we can see that she's thinking of something, and we're imagining something, and she's imagining this fire that we see in the background or around her, around the inset, and this house burning down. Again, this is connected to this story in this magazine. But what's interesting here is that we have this use of multiple panels to tell a story. Okay. We have similar sort of series of pictures used to tell a story in magazines like we have here. This is a serialized story, and so we have a combination of text and then side by side with these illustrations showing the different parts of the story, the different actions laid out. And I would suggest that this is really where we see the ukiyo-e tradition, the printmaking tradition, beginning to migrate into the manga tradition. Now, manga is a word that existed before this, and it literally means just whimsical or playful pictures, sort of like doodles or sketches. And one of the most famous and most successful manga were these by Hokusai, who really became so famous and so successful that I guess at one point in his career, he just decided, I'm going to make a whole bunch of books of just random sketches and see if people will buy them. And so he did, and they did. And he has, we have many volumes of different little things. Here are two of them, sketches of insects and a frog, and then of men bathing on the right. sort of cartoonish, just fun, as the word suggests, whimsical pictures. Now, of course, we use the word manga today to describe Japanese comic books. And when we look at histories of manga, they usually suggest that they begin with the introduction of American Western comics to Japan in the post-war era, as Americans were stationed in Japan, bringing the comic books with them and influencing the artists there. So we have this massive increase after World War II in the production of print material. Prior to that, during the war, there was such a premium on all materials that there was no ability, there was no excess. Magazines, comic books, novels were simply too extraneous. They were not necessary. They were not published because there was no really material or labor available for them. But afterwards, after the war, there's this explosion of print material. And I would submit that Japanese comic books, these manga, are really the descendants, the modern day ancestors of the Uki Away prints that we've been looking at. And some people, I'm sure, would argue this, but if you consider they're both printed media, so they're both mass produced, they're both considered to be popular art versus high art. These are not fine art objects. In fact, in Japan, Uki Away prints have not been considered art. They are not studied by Japanese art historians until recently. They were just not even worth talking about to them. They are both affordable. These are things that normal people can afford and enjoy. They're not restricted to a particular class or caste. They are both produced using a division of labor. In the Uki Away prints, we have a painter, a carver, someone who applies the ink, someone who prints it, someone who publishes it and distributes. It's a very complex system with people filling different roles. In the same way, in manga, usually the writer of the story is also the artist. However, you also have someone who does the inking, the coloring, if there's color. The text is often written in by someone else. You have publishers, distributors, this whole team working to produce these things. And in both cases, you have this heavy reliance on line and composition, because if you're just working with black ink on paper, you don't have color necessarily to move the image, to catch the viewers' attention and engage them. So you're relying on line, on shape, and on surface. And both address a wide array of subjects. Uki Away prints, are just, they're referred to as a genre, but it's a massive genre. Again, as I said before, it's prints of the floating world, of the ephemeral world, of the everyday. And that could be anything, as we've seen, erotica, actor prints, beauties, legends, landscapes, what have you. And in the same way, manga is an entire category of, it's a medium, not a genre. So many, many different subjects. All right. So we've had to really speed through the history of Japanese woodblock prints. However, I hope you've enjoyed this and that you've been intrigued enough to look into this more and gained an appreciation for what is a really fascinating medium. Thank you very much for joining me, and please stay tuned for my next lecture, which will be on understanding pre-modern Chinese art. Thank you all very much.